Good evening. 5 months ago, on the 75th anniversary of VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, we presented an interview with Jack Bertram, an extraordinary World War II pilot who had flown 36 air combat missions without the loss of a crew member. This B-17 pilot, as you might remember, was 99 years old when we showed this interview. Now, on this Veterans Day 2020, we celebrate Jack Bertram's 100th birthday. Jack is home tonight with his family watching this webcast, and I know you'll join me in saying, Happy 100th birthday, Jack, to one of the greatest living legends in the country today. Our interview tonight is with a slightly younger man, but who is also very special. The story goes back 100 years to a time when his father, Jim Kavanaugh Sr., was in law school at the University of Virginia. Following graduation, he started his family in Roanoke, where his namesake and the subject of our interview was born. Now, Jim Kavanaugh Sr. could not have known that World War I, his war, the war to end all wars, was a prelude to World War II. 2 decades later. This was a worldwide conflict that would send his son into air combat with a greater than 50% casualty rate. Like so many families, there was a shared military obligation. Jim's younger brother would also join the Air Force, where he served as a test pilot, tragically dying in flight in service to his country. Now, when young Jim Kavanaugh graduated from high school in 1943, this magazine was in barbershops and homes across America. Jim decided to sign up and join these heroes of the 8th Air Force, most of whom in 1943 would never return home. Also, Jim brought with him from Roanoke this book, War and Peace. He started this book, and it was the only book that he was never able to finish. Even so, I think you'll agree that he has a great deal to teach us about the subject. This is the story of a teenager who completed 25 missions as a radio operator in a B-17 before the age of 20. This is the story of a serpentine survey of life in and out of academe, followed by medical school, residency, fellowship, and service as a faculty member in the School of Medicine. He had been taught by professors who had distinguished themselves in World War II in combat hospitals. Now, this video starts with a reminder of his father's service in World War I and Jim's own realization as a teenager that he was bound for war to join so many others of his generation in a war from which so many would never return. This Colonnade Club program would not be possible without the support of the Johnson Family Foundation. As it happens, the first interview conducted with Jim was a number of years ago by way of the ParadeRest Oral History Project. That interview and so many others have been sent to the Library of Congress for posterity. But this interview tonight is especially for you and centenarian Jack Bertram on this 75th Veterans Day after World War II. Now, for those watching, please send your questions by way of the chat function. And following the interview, Jim will answer as many as possible on air. And for those that there's not time to answer, they'll be happy to have answered in writing. Those answers will be posted on the Colonnade Club and the ParadeRest websites. So thank you, Jim, for spending this evening with us and sharing with us your most powerful experiences.
I remember that my friends and I were very interested in the war in Europe, and actually in the pre-war, which was, 39 and earlier. And we followed sources like Time and Life, and all of us somehow had read about a book called Little Wars that H.G. Wells had written about play wars on the board, and we tried to make layouts like that for war and estimate what would be attacked and how it would be defended and this sort of thing, without any really knowledge sources, but knowing that many, many people in the world were already wearing uniforms and carrying guns, and these were young people, and that it seemed inevitable that it was like a snowball. It was picking up more and more as it rolled along, and it was unlikely that America could somehow avoid all that. But from things that I had read in the library at school and in our own books and so forth, was our military budgets had largely gone for defending the Philippines, Hawaii, and the Panama Canal. And it was a real shock to read in the paper how much devastation had gone on at Hawaii and Pearl Harbor without much damage being done to the attacker.
I had a chance to look at your high school yearbook, and I found it striking how in 1943, as a senior in high school, it was so preoccupied with the war, and just about every page there are references to the war and to the fact that those who graduated would be called into service. Was that your expectation as well?
I think all the males from 17 on, having registered for the draft, were either going right into the military with their family's approval, or were going to be drafted when they were 18, and there wasn't even any question about it. That's just the way things were, and that I think the people I knew just accepted that. To me, it kind of went along with citizenship or something. And I never remember any young person haggling over, well, if we can't vote or we can't buy beer, we shouldn't go in the army or anything like that. That when they said, come on, we need you. Because I remember a black and white movie, and I don't remember what it was, but I remember a scene in which the American flag was being lowered. It must have been at sunset. Maybe it's just part of the plot. I don't remember that. But then it suddenly occurred to me, if they win, all the flags will come down and they will never go up again. And I thought, that is a bad thing. And I would not want that to happen. And I would do what I could to see that that didn't happen. And to me, that was like logical syllogism or something. There's no answer to that. Of course you would do it. I was drafted. It didn't seem to me to make much difference because you'd go either way.
Right.
And the idea that if they drafted you, you would have some choices appealed to me, though I knew very little about what the choices were. When you see something like an Army specification list, the thousands of positions they have, how would you know about any of these? And, I mean, radio operator is 756 and the radio gunner is 757, but who would know this, not being in there? And a young person, maybe it's not true anymore, but then I think we were more wanting to be sure that we passed other judgments from people whom we allowed to be the judge than to tell them how they should use us or something. Finishing high school, even in an academic track that I was on, did not prepare you for anything in the military. Mm-hmm. They had to take you, and I knew a guy in the military that his job was teaching recruits to tie neckties. The people coming in that had never worn a necktie, I mean, they just got who they got and then made them into a fighting force. And believe me, that when you look at the results, that was an excellent job done.
And then prior to going to England, where you'd be based, you trained in the United States, and you trained in places far away from Virginia.
Yeah. It just seemed to get farther and farther away. I mean, Camp Lee is in Virginia, but 3 days, and North Carolina's next door, and that was maybe 6 weeks or something. And then I went to South Dakota, which is a long way, because I'd never been beyond West Virginia and Washington, D.C. in my whole growing up. And then from there, I went to Yuma, Arizona. And all this is pre-flying, though there was some airborne training in South Dakota, and a lot more in Yuma, which was an aerial gunnery school. And then I came back to the Midwest and was assigned to a crew where all the different training people came together, the pilots and co-pilots and ball gunners and tail gunners, and everyone was formed into a crew. And from then on, anywhere we went with our own, we took a plane and flew it, because that's what we did. But you certainly get an appreciation, one, from the time it takes to go before you're flying, even when you're flying, and the size of the country when you're over it and looking down. That was a real education in itself. I know the Navy used to use that on their recruiting posters, join the Navy and see the world, but that's just a side effect of being in the Air Force.
At what point did you find that you would be going to England?
Well, it amused all of us, I think. We're always told loose lips sink ships, and don't talk, and don't. And so every effort was made to misinform us. So right before we were getting ready to fly on what was ending up with a flight to England, they gave us mosquito netting and mosquito material, and I think we were all supposed to think we were going to Guadalcanal or something, because nobody ever told us either way. But by the time we got to Newfoundland, we realized we weren't heading toward anything in the Pacific. We were getting farther away. So that was the only other place there was.
So tell us about England in those days and what that experience was like.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it was sort of like not knowing what an insane asylum is like. The sources were so scattered and so shallow that we didn't know that much. And then in the wartime censorship, we were told such selective things about what was going on. We knew who the enemy were. Frank Capra directed a great series of films, still available, called While We Fight. And we all had to watch that and so forth. But that's where we first met other civilians. I mean, the British had put most of their manpower in service, and then moved them on. So the towns were not full, and they were bombed and so forth. But I always had an admiration for the British. I thought they were very generous and receptive. And a couple things I remember. Once I was on pass and had gone to a place to rent a boat, and a kid loaned or gave me some fishing tackle. And by the time I got back, it took me a while. He wasn't there, so I left the fishing tackle with the boat guy, and I hope it got back to him. But I thought that was very generous, because the British were hard pressed for everything, food, clothing ration, transportation. Another thing that you learn quickly in the Army, the one time that you salute and your salute is not returned is to a pay officer. So you salute and identify yourself, and he doesn't take his hands off the money, but you're paid in the money of where you are. So when we started being paid in British money, it was different denominations, different sizes. It didn't look like money. But I was really upset on the train one time when some Americans were just looking at coins and throwing them off of the train. This was not limited to Americans. Mm-hmm. I thought, this is not the thing you would do if you were a guest in someone's house and they brought you a cookie, or you wouldn't throw it out the window. But they did. Another thing I remember about, I fell off of a truck one time and broke my wrist. It didn't count as a war wound, but I couldn't fly for a while. And I was on pass, and I was in a carnival sort of, and some people were urging me to take shots or something, and a motherly woman on the other side of me could see just about an inch of the cast out of my sleeve, and she punched somebody in the shoulder and pointed at my wrist. It's like saying, leave him alone. He can't do this, and it's all right. And without saying anything, like she hadn't even noticed, but, I noticed.
Your experience in the air. You flew 25 missions out of your base in England. And to be on a B-17 crew like you were was the most dangerous single thing that any military person did in the war. I mean, it was the most dangerous in terms of casualties, wounded, prisoners of war, etc. And as I understand it, a lot of the early research on PTSD was with those of you in the 8th Air Force because of the unusual circumstance. I mean, you could be going out in the daytime to go to a bookstore or something like that, knowing that your next mission could well be the last day of your life. And I mean, ultimately you went into psychiatry, but I wonder if you can just comment on that. Were they right to look at this group of flyers to try and understand stress?
You're going into danger. The closer you get to your target area, the more dangerous it's getting. Not that there aren't other dangers, but I remember the first mission we flew was we called chaff, and the British called window. It was just precise lengths of aluminum foil that were tuned to radar frequencies, and it was thrown from the plane, and the backwash of the plane would pop these bundles and spread it so that the radar was essentially getting signals from all over, not from a plane, but it looked like a plane. And the first time we used it, the radio operator released it because you had nothing to do. That was actually hard on the bomb runs because your job wasn't right then. So you had a big cardboard box of these bundles and a chute by your seat. And you just slid them through at a certain interval. You could look behind our flight that day because it was a cold wintry day, and over the clouds and behind you, you could see all this flak going off in the air, not anywhere near. Now, the Germans quickly learned to put in tuning units in their flak so that as soon as they knew that was happening, they'd go to another frequency and it would get hard again. And then we retaliated for that. Again, this is where brain power is going against brain power. We call them Mickey Mouse ships. They would put in, instead of the ball turret, there would be a radar dome coming out of that same place in the ship. And the operator would have a radar jammer tuned. And as soon as he knew they were tuned in on a frequency, he could change his jamming frequency. They would have to change their frequency away from that, and he would be searching for it and so forth. And that was like having invisible chaff that you could shape in the ship to put out. But, well, it's better than whistling in a graveyard, but nevertheless, if you have enough flak guns and so forth, something gets through.
In your training, once you were there in England, being encouraged by those who, explained the value of your missions, can you recall?
There would be a formal training track. You learn more from people doing the same job, but were ahead of you. Like somebody, if you come in and somebody's done 15 missions and you haven't done any, you would kind of like to hear him say something. But frequently the last thing those people want to do is talk about flying missions, because you have a pub on your base and you have passes periodically. They made a real effort. The group had 4 squadrons, and they usually flew 3 squadrons and stood down 1, so that squadron for a day or two would not fly, so people could catch their breath and so forth. But if they flew what they call a maximum effort, they could fly all 4 squadrons at once, plus everything that would fly, to get a lot of planes in the air.
Now, you had your choice. I mean, any time that you felt uncomfortable about flying, you could opt out, couldn't you? How many times did you do that?
Yeah, I think we're all volunteers, and you could withdraw that. It would be a terrible thing, though. I mean, you would lose face, if we believed in that, with all your comrades, because they're all doing the same thing. And you'd lose face with yourself, because you would be reneging on something you had agreed to do. And I remember there was one guy we knew that he had done that. He'd lost his stripes, and he would just he'd go in town and buy eggs for the mess hall and just little things like that. He wasn't dismissed from the military, but it must have been a miserable life. I mean, you're talking about walking death. I don't think that would be the only thing that would motivate people, but I think people could feel moved a little by that, because you can fly people till they can't fly anymore, just like you can have soldiers in the front line till they just can't do anymore, because we're not structured to live that way. You can be trained and you can kind of push yourself, but everybody has a limit to that. And then there must be something, it's a crazy button or something, because some people seem to not be particularly moved by that. But I would say anybody we would consider in the range of normal could be frightened.
In the film 12 O'Clock High, there was a focus on the issue of superstition, that people had certain superstitions. Is that something that you saw in your squadron, or that you felt yourself? Lucky, and what it meant to be lucky, and how you could be luckier.
I don't think you could exactly feel that you could control luck, but I've had the feeling on some missions that if I get out of this mission, they'll never get me in again. And then you fly for an hour and you're getting away, and you're over the North Sea, and you think, well, maybe one more, but this is no life for a good country boy like me. And maybe some people just can't change that. But I think people do start to have little rituals. We were recommended to take a pair of shoes along with us and just to tie them onto our parachute harness, because the flying suit was heated and the boots were heated, but they were not walking boots. And I sort of convinced myself if I took the shoes along, I would need them. And if I didn't take them along, I wouldn't need them. So I never took them along. And now I think that's not a rigorous logical conclusion. But everybody had something like that. I mean, and people would not call their 13th mission their 13th mission. I mean, not all, but many. They were flying 12B today or something like that. I mean, little things like that. But people would be very touchy if you called them on that. When you're kind of cornered in a situation that you can't control, you have to fake some kind of control, really.
So, 25 missions. Is there a mission that specifically stood out for you as being one that was even more dangerous? They were all dangerous.
I think because we were worked in with a number of new crews, the first couple of missions were not too bad. It seems to me, as I remember them, they were in France, or they weren't long missions, and compared to what went on later on, they weren't typical. But if they were typical, they didn't seem so bad. And then we flew a mission over the Rhineland or something in about maybe number 6. And it's the first time that I could hear and feel flak. It was so close that it was moving the ship, and you could hear them popping on. And that really impressed me, that if shells are going off that close to you, there's nothing going to stop the next one from being even closer. It may be on the way right now, and you just can't tell. And then pretty soon you're scaring yourself, maybe more than you should be. Because, as I say, the pilots and navigators and the bombardiers got busier as it got more dangerous because they had to fly in very tight formation, certain path, so forth. But the radio, there was radio silence, so we didn't originate anything. We just listened. And on the bomb run, until we got to flak, we didn't have anything to do. Mm-hmm. It was kind of nice to know that at least you could be doing that. You can burn a little energy. Mm-hmm. Because I mentioned earlier that, I'd broken my wrist. The day that I broke my wrist, I didn't know it was broken, and I went on and was flying, and my wrist was getting sorer and sorer. I couldn't hold a pencil. I'm right-handed, and but I noticed when we went on the bomb run, I had no awareness of a pain in my wrist, and I was throwing flak just like I would have any time. And then we got off the bomb run and it started hurting again. So it was really physiological experiments. It's very clear. They were lecturing us and give us an indoctrination. And some person in the morale services said, if you get to the target with your bombs on the first mission and don't get back, you will have paid for all the cost of training and so forth. And our reaction, what do you mean don't get back? We're not coming here to fly one-way missions. We're flying round trips.
Safety in England must have felt like a pretty safe place.
The dangers did collect where the buildings and the docks and the people were. The only time I was ever in the countryside in a pub or something, and it was a bombing raid, and they were announcing green, yellow, red, and feeling like being on the other end of bombing, it was a bad feeling that you just had to sit there and wait for it to fall on your head. And I thought, we are on the other end of this most of the time when we're letting go out. But if you went to London if you went during the Blitz or when the V1s and the V2s were coming, you never had any trouble getting a hotel room or anything. There weren't many people. Cause I remember one time I went to get a room, and the clerk said, "And what's your name?" And I said, "It's Kavanaugh." And he said, "Oh, I'm one of those fine Irishmen. You don't find any Englishmen around here tonight." I thought they started still chip on his shoulder, because I don't think we felt that way. Mm-hmm. I mean, anybody that was in it was in it.
And you were awakened one night.
They were shaking and rumbling, and my first thought, because I was not half asleep, was the guy was working on the stove too hard and shaking the pipes, and all of a sudden the dust and all cleared away, and the side of the building was gone, and I could see the big tail of one of our planes with a K. We were on Kimbolton was our field, sitting right there, and I was wide awake because planes do not sit right beside the barracks. Quickly, we all realized that a takeoff plane had crashed. We also knew, without even stopping to think, that all those planes taking off were going on a mission, were loaded with bombs and ammunition and gasoline, and there it was. And we all took off, and heading out of the barracks, which was partly destroyed, another person came, and we both saw pair of feet and boots, flying boots. So we each grabbed a leg and pulled him out. But as soon as we pulled him out, we realized he had no head. He'd been clipped right across the neck, clean cut. I mean, it wasn't even bleeding. It just looked like a red velvet. But again, you get so self-preservationist. We again immediately knew we couldn't do anything. Mm-hmm. And we just dropped him. We were all heading out like ants out of an anthill. I never heard what caused that, but our group had a top rating, the least planes ever turned back in a mission with engine trouble and that sort of thing, a very high rating group. But it's funny, that occasion, when I wasn't even flying, just standing, deciding what I was going to do after breakfast. And one time we were loaning a plane. All of a sudden, the plane didn't feel right, and I looked, and we'd gone 90 degrees, and the tip of the wing was almost on the ground. We were just taking off, and I thought, Christ, 2 more feet, that's going to snag, and then we're going to cartwheel, and then we're goners. Yeah. But they straightened it up. And I thought, that's funny. I'm concerned about flying and the dangers of flying, but this is just incidental to being in the air. And a lot of people were killed that way. Or when the formations would take off one at a time, and then they would form over the group into their squadron, and then into their group, and then into the line of groups. And there could be collisions because it was early in the morning. And there would be a lead ship that did nothing but fly in a circle and fire flares, which were saying, form on me. But sometimes it doesn't happen that way. Even when you're in a group that's very well trained and has done this dozens of times, something can always happen.
How many planes did you fly in?
I don't know. We never had our own plane.
So it wasn't like Memphis Belle where there was one plane that you got attached to and...
Toward the end, they were flying more planes, and it was sort of like a rental agency. You just went to the lot, and they'd give you a plane, and you trusted it. All the equipment had been checked, and everything was ready, and that was mostly true. Because even something like flying missions can get routine, because starting somewhere in London, some panel is saying, we're going to bomb synthetic oil today. And it goes out through various tentacles. Where's the most vulnerable plant? Where have we not gone recently? Where should we go? And then start asking different wings and so forth, how many can they supply, and what kind of bombs, and is there enough gasoline? And reading about it later, you realize what an immense coordinated machine that is, that makes all that happen and gives all those guys breakfast, and if any of them have a fever, puts them in the sick bay instead of flying them and so forth. And the other side is doing the same thing. I'm sure there's a better way to interact.
Was reading your escape?
I wasn't as interested in going and buying beer and singing because there were still large bookstores well stocked in London. And they weren't too expensive. I mean, they varied. They had expensive books too. And just like they had some records were still available.
Were there any books that you started and you didn't finish?
Only War and Peace. Because I had not read War and Peace before I went in, and it supposedly was one of the great war novels, I had an edition that I took with me from Roanoke, and I started it. But it was in that barracks that the plane crashed into that burned, and I lost all my books and all my clothes, except what I was wearing, everything. In fact, we spent about 2 or 3 weeks, all the people who had been in several Quonset huts sleeping in the gym, which was an interesting experience. You talk about a noisy creature that was groaning and dreaming and so forth. And it was, at night, you could just tell these people are not sleeping well. But they went on flying.
And then VE Day came. Victory in Europe, the end of your 25 missions. Did you ever get into a B-17 after that?
No, we knew that we were running low on targets. Everything had been bombed. And the military was moving at the same time on the ground. So that, the potential targets were disappearing. But still, it seemed to come kind of fast because people had talked about it, Home for Christmas, and all along, a lot of scuttlebutt about it's going to be over and so forth. And when that happened, the group was stood down. The ground crews were shipped to the Far East right away, and they were to service B-29s. And we were told by rumor mostly, but I think it was true, that the flying crews were coming back and were going to be retrained on B-29s and then go to the South Pacific. But we came back on Queen Mary. We didn't fly back. And the group of us that came on the Queen Mary were very small, and we were all high-ranking enlisted personnel. So we never had to do anything. We were with the Harry Truman's World War I Army Division. I think it was the 36 or something like that. They had to do KP and all that, and they fed around the clock. There were so many people to feed on this thing. It took a couple of days. And we knew we were home when we came off. They greeted all these grizzly fighting men with cartons of milk, real milk, and quite welcome, too. We were still in England. A member of the group had gone to the movies, and most of us had gone to bed, and he came back, and we thought he'd just been drinking too much. He'd seen the atom bomb pictures, and in the middle of the night, he was trying to tell us what had happened in Asia. But all he could say was, and then there was nothing. It just went off and there was nothing. We thought, go to bed. It's too late. We don't want to hear any of that stuff. But it caught everybody that surprise. I mean, the planning for landing in Japan was far advanced.
So you expected that would be the next group of missions?
Yeah. I mean, everybody expected that.
Yeah.
I mean, what else could they do with you?
So then it was off to college. I mean, had you always in high school assumed that you'd be going to college?
most of my people had gone to college, and so it was assumed that you went to college. The choice would be where you would go and what you would study. So I hadn't thought much about it. So there was a kind of a disjointed period. We veterans called it the 5220 Club. For a year, you could get $20 a week after you were out, since you were not in the military. So that was a little bit of money, pocket money. And I remember them tried to minimalize too. They had a little lapel pin that we all call the ruptured duck, that was for veterans. I haven't seen one for ages now. But so I was sort of bouncing around Roanoke and trying to figure out what to do next. Didn't feel any urgency, was certainly relieved that there wasn't an urgency. But then there's a gnawing feeling that, time's moving on. You better fall in somewhere.
So that first year in Charlottesville, what was the town like at that time? Was it just full of returning service members? The university must have looked
they
quite a
were
bit
crowded with ex-servicemen. It's a backlog, and a great many of them were really all business. They had been pulled out of something in the middle, and they were already family people and ready to go, and they were hard workers, and to allow for makeup, school was running year round, and there was also a sort of roaring 20s crowd that was just going to have a good time from the same kind of background, and so as much as possible, the university was running as it had before the war. Coat and tie, a lot of politeness and respect for the teachers and the students and for everybody.
Was housing difficult to come by?
Because of the numbers alone, the housing was difficult. There were just more students than there were places. I felt fortunate that I knew a guy who had gotten on a room at the old Twyman place on Rugby, and there was another room there. I heard through him, and I was able to get that. And Jimmy Twyman was still in the military, but his wife was there at that house and pregnant. She was a nurse, and they just wanted some people in the house. They couldn't get round-the-clock help, so they made those rooms available to students, and that worked very well for me because, having gone from high school to where they paid you well and fed you and gave you a uniform and health care and everything, I wasn't used to making X amount of money last a month. So it was during that period that I quit smoking, because I looked at the money and the meals and the days, and something had to go. I went to work at the Salem VA, an attendant in the psych hospital.
So these patients were, many of them were your age and had been through what you'd been through.
Exactly. The bulk of the patient population was World War II. And I felt closer to them because, I could understand. It didn't seem that different from anybody else that I knew, except that they didn't go home at night. Some of them had, strange habits, or if I had any kind of internal scale for judging sanity and insanity, they would have passed as sane, because I had no yardstick, no personal encounters, not read about it, not thought about it.
Well, Houston made a film at the time called "Let There Be Light," and it was about the trauma, psychological trauma that veterans suffered, military personnel suffered during World War II. And there was a film, 1946, that won the Academy Award, The Best Years of Our Lives, which also spoke to the damage and the consequences and the cost.
I know that film. I've not seen it from end to end. I've seen pieces of it through the years, and I know the adjustments were difficult because I've even seen World War I movies in which the returning veterans had difficulties if they tried to displace people who'd taken their jobs and all, because the people who'd had the jobs for years even felt that they were their jobs. So I other than feeling kind of empathy for the patients, I was mostly puzzled by what was supposed to be wrong with them. I mean, who decided that this one went to a hospital and others must not have been? They couldn't all have been in the hospital, because I couldn't have done it. And the more I knew them, and the more I worked with them and talked with them, played chess with them, and the more I found the islets of normality in them. And then I wondered about what was influencing their behavior to where they couldn't function. I knew that some of them must have been unable to function in the normal world, or it would seem too strange to them or something. And then I thought, I'm supposed to be carrying out helpful orders. And I began to wonder about that too.
It was so long ago, but do you still have really crystal clear memories of some of the patients that you worked with at the time?
Oh, yeah. The first place I went was a push unit for patients who had had prefrontal lobotomies, which I knew nothing about at the time, except they all had indentations on their brows where they'd had plugs taken out. But again, we were supposed to help them, and I remember one fellow I thought was very nice, and his delusion, which I didn't even know the difference between that and illusions and hallucinations and so forth, but he felt that he still smelled because he'd gotten out of a burning tank in Italy and the rest of the crew hadn't, and he was convinced everybody could smell burning flesh in him and knew that he had left his buddies and shouldn't have. And he seemed kind of relaxed and afterwards, and I asked him how had it helped him, and did he still have that smell? And he said, yes, but it just doesn't bother me anymore. So I thought, that's a big trade-off for a piece of your brain. I mean, a lot of these were college students and all. These were not bums. I did know enough to know this is irreversible.
Mm-hmm.
You don't put these pieces back in, they rewire. And we did lose an occasional patient, but mostly it was not fatal. But it kind of made people bland.
So you had gone to the university as an undergraduate. You were there for a year or two, and then it wasn't for you. So you went and you worked as an attendant in this veterans hospital. How in the world did you get back into academe after having sampled it and found that it had not been to your liking?
Well, even I could admit that I didn't meet him halfway. And some of that I may have brought with me from having gone early into the military and so forth. But anyway, I think it was getting married and having the responsibility of a family and some children and a wife who didn't feel like I should have stopped my education at that point anyhow, and who was willing to take another shot at it. All I had to do was ask them to reinstate me, and they did. The difference between feeling that I was a pre-med and that the grades would be looked at when I asked for another step was a great motivator, because I was a poor attender of classes, much less turning in work. And yet people were extremely tolerant, because occasionally I'd get a class I liked and I would do very well. So it seemed to the teachers like there was some kind of blockage that wasn't an inability. I went from being practically on cut probation every semester to dean's list. It's like twin brothers, the bad brothers dropped out and the good brothers come to save the day.
Coming back to the university now in the 1950s as an undergraduate, finishing your undergraduate years and then going into medical school. The university was growing. Charlottesville was growing. Carol's Tea Room was a thing, wasn't it?
Yeah. So it was strange that it was such a little place and had such a big reputation and a big consumer body. The saying about them always was no carols, no room, no tea, because they were so crowded, but they sold beer wholesale practically, and fraternities would buy cases and kegs and so forth there. At that time, Virginia's outstanding reputation was as a party school. Party weekends and all would draw a large crowd of people, not just other students and all. Mm-hmm. There were always, I know there were scholars and advanced degree students, and Alderman Library's always been a strong academic library, but I think the Gentleman's Sea, or a hook as they called it, was enough to, some people just seemed to just want a degree to say they were a graduate. They didn't need the learning material. They had a position in a family business or something that they would have had if they had never come. But it just was nice to go to reunions. And
so you went from one uniform as an airman, in essence, to another uniform as a student.
It seemed like other people had a lot to say about what you did, when, where, how. But looking back on it, I was a challenging student, and a lot of teachers put extra effort and were very good to me in ways that I didn't appreciate at the time. And they would have thought that was part of the teacher's job. Medicine never seemed like something that you could overlearn or know too much, that patients deserve doctors who knew a lot and kept up and cared about patients and so forth.
Did the decision to go into psychiatry was in part because you felt that you might be able to do better for patients than you sometimes saw happen at the VA?
Well, the first ones that I saw, if I couldn't have done better, I shouldn't have been in medicine. But then I saw what I thought were better doctors and better trained and better motivated. I thought they were excellent working companions and some are inspirational people. You find out about some of the hard-working people.
Who inspired you?
Actually, being a reader, sometimes it's not ones you've known personally, but you've known about their exploits. And some bacteriologist who discovers a vaccine or something makes a real difference. And to me, a good doctor doesn't have to bankrupt somebody else or do anything to anybody else. If he can do his own patients well, that justifies it.
So from undergraduate to right on to medical school here at the university, and then on to psychiatry residency.
I've come to believe that a lot of professional training, or particularly something as interpersonal as psychiatry, is helping a person to develop the skills they already have.
In those post-war years, there were a number of professors in the School of Medicine who had served in the war in the 8th evac, a remarkable hospital that was really the university's hospital.
Yeah.
Who are those that you remember and brought with them what they had learned in the war and brought that those values with them?
It's funny, the ones I knew about were well treated in Bird Level's book, the 8th evac, about the hospital, but I don't remember them as particularly stressing that.
So they didn't talk about the war, even though they had served.
Yeah, whereas our family doctor, when I was a kid in Roanoke, had been a medic doctor in First World War, and he had a kit in his office, the Red Cross on it, that he had carried in battle and had bullet holes in it. He kind of told you that he had practiced some under adverse conditions. Child, I remember admiring that and thinking it doesn't show. He's very good to us, and he's not tougher. And he's a nice man. We liked him because we weren't very sick.
You decided to go into child psychiatry and then teach here on the faculty of the School of Medicine.
When I found out that that was a recognized subspecialty, that it needed people, and that children could be that sick, I did want to do child psychiatry.
What have you taken from your experience in combat in World War II? How has that influenced you and the person that and the doctor that you became?
It isn't that World War II found unusual people. Unusual circumstances allowed people to show traits that they wouldn't have had occasion to show otherwise. I just don't believe that one generation just happens to encapsulate all these qualities that are missing before and afterwards. And sometimes you can't even train it. We all heard an interview I remember of a lady working in a school office, a person threatening to come and kill everybody in it and so forth. And she was not a trained person. She had not had one of these super courses about how you lead someone. She just kept talking to him, and pretty soon he apologized and came in and gave her the guns. And I thought, that is so true, that there are people like this is sort of underground waiting, and you can count on them. You can look at, to me, say a high school football team, and you could almost pick out the guys, if you had to put them in a war situation, would come out with medals. You're not going to let X down. You're not going to let your people down. You're not going to let yourself down. Talents and special skills are randomly distributed in the population. It's just something about you that makes you stay up all night and write a symphony. I wouldn't do that. I know that. But there are people who would.
Jim, people who know you well know that that Dante is someone who you've always had a great interest in. And I wonder if you can just tell us about that.
I think the idea of excellence has always challenged me, for people like Dante to remember everything, read everything worth reading, put it all together, and then put a new twist on it that's impressive. I think you have to honor the achievers, to know and kind of respond to the best that the race has produced, because we certainly produced some sour, rotten apples, but that's not all.
Mm-hmm. Are you ever going to read War and Peace?
No, I don't think so. I don't feel that there's a big gap in my knowledge that would be filled in. I really, at this stage, think I would be braced up more by reading a good book that I understood about the periodic table than I do about War and Peace. I don't read much fiction.
Well, on this 75th anniversary of Veterans Day, it used to be called Armistice Day, I just want to express my appreciation to you for sharing your thoughts, and we'll open this up to questions from the audience. Want to thank you again.
My pleasure, as they say, it really is. One of the things you can do is reminisce. When you've given up a lot of activities, you're hanging on to that one. People who've had a more or less successful long journey, you know they've met a lot of help and a lot of friends and a lot of people along the way that made it worthwhile. And I certainly am in that category, and I know it, and I appreciate it.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation. It was absolutely marvelous. Were you pleased with it?
Yeah.
Well, good. Well, we have a question from Vamek Volkan, who I believe is a colleague and friend of yours.
Yes.
He wants to know how your war experiences influenced your decision to become a child psychiatrist.
I think it started with what we reviewed with adult psychiatry, predecessors of being on a ward with the standard of treatment at that time, which struck me as a layman, but knowing nothing about any treatments, wasn't very good because I didn't feel comfortable that we were doing the best we could for these people. And as I found out more about the adults, I had not realized up until that time that serious problems could affect the very young. I think I was influenced by the school books of children happy in school and playing and holidays and so forth. When I realized that, it made sense to me, though the training went to the grown-up stage and worked there, that studying the evolution of problems and successful problem solving made a lot of sense. And I still feel that way.
Oh, well, that's great. Thank you. So one of the other questions from Doug, it comes from Doug List. He wanted to know if you changed the crew or did you have the same crew on all the time? And have you stayed in touch with any of them?
I didn't stay in very close touch. My pilot made a number of trips through this state after the war and would drop by and we would talk about events in the war that I had not realized, such as dangerous situations that weren't always shared with the crew who didn't need to know. The crews tended to stay together, but like I mentioned, I had a broken wrist and couldn't fly for a couple of missions. So there had to be a substitute radio operator. And on occasion, I had myself flown as a radio operator with a crew that was strangers to me. So we were interchangeable to that extent, but mostly we had identification with the people covering each position. And the enlisted men bunked together and ate together, mostly went on pass together. Officers did the same, but there were not a lot of distancing between officers and enlisted men when you're flying the same plane on the same mission. They were mostly related to age and the complexity of the position that you had been trained to fulfill in the crew.
Yeah, that's so fascinating because you really do become like brothers.
Well, you get very close to people who've shared experiences, even if you don't discuss them. You know, you were there and they were there. So it does make for a kind of closeness.
Yeah, so we have a question from Cindy Allen. She said the 352nd Fighter Group was a predecessor of the Virginia Air National Guard 192nd Fighter Group that were based out of Richmond. They were in the 8th Air Force. Did you ever run into any of those guys? Any of the other Virginia guys?
Not from a fighter group. The bomber people tended to somewhat stick together, and fighter people stuck together because one, they flew solo, they didn't have a crew. You know, one ship, one operator. I did meet other Virginians on our ground crews, and there was a vast number of positions backing up all the flying and operating. There are meteorologists and photo people and the whole medical crews and plane servicing and so forth. It was a big, well-run operation.
Wow, that's great. So we have another question. It says, can you comment on emotional resilience and the current society and its focus on childhood trauma when you look at World War II? You know, do you think there are differences now with current society and its focus on childhood trauma versus what you grew up with and what happened during World War II?
The breadth of that question runs into our clock, I think.
Yeah, it probably does.
Certainly, you partake of the language of your culture just like you speak the language, and a lot of it is even related to unspoken parts of what you've learned. But I think from my work with young people on the succession of stages of learning various operations of running their body and interpreting its sensory input and so forth, I think there's more similarity between growing up people and than dissimilarity. There's no question that everybody having an iPhone now when they're 2 years old will make a difference, and we don't know yet what that might be. And it's hard for some of my friends younger to know what it means to spend your youth without television in any form, and yet it can be done, and you compensate because you fill the 24 hours one way or another.
Well, that's great. That's a great answer. So someone else asked a very easy question. Where were you stationed in England?
The little town was called Kimbolton, and we occupied what had formerly been an RAF base. Now, a number of the bases of the 8th Air Force, they expanded so much, were built new, but the RAF shared a lot of the bases with the American crew. And other than this rail station where we could get a train to London or something, I never spent much time in the little town. And there's some people that like the British pubs and spent some time there, but we had beer available on base. So you didn't have to go to town. But they did make an effort to, it was believed probably truth to it, that what was called rest and rehabilitation, either unusually difficult situations or just the number of missions and so forth, would kind of qualify people to have this sort of thing. But they even had special locations within Britain that were, they weren't hospitals exactly, but they were sort of like assisted living, getting people to have a little confidence in the future or hope for the future or something like that.
Well, that's great. So Cindy Allen says she has a B-17 vacuum tube radio that she used to listen to the Indianapolis 500 on, and it still works. She thought you might want to know that. And is there anything you remember about those about operating that radio that you want to share?
As that I tried to make clear, the radio position on a mission, we were under radio silence. But our radios were on, we could receive missions. There was a station called it a 7MT. I can still hear it. It was a very low, powerful thing. The Germans seemed unable to jam it. It could always come through however deep we were in Germany. We also had a number of different radios. For instance, there was a trailing antenna that you could let out 450 feet of antenna from the plane with a weight on the end of it. You had to figure you'd have it all wound back in before you landed, because it would hit the ground before the plane did and come flying back. And we had another commercial frequency radio that we could get commercial stations of different countries, and sometimes coming back, we could run that through the cruise set, so they could hear musical programs from Paris or something like that. But I always had to have the main line of communication open so that I could hear if a message identified for our group, which you had an identity for that mission, some crazy name, so that you were alerted to that.
Oh, well, that's great. That's great. So one more question, two more quick questions. One is, do you have any recommendations for promoting mental health development in our children and grandchildren?
Oh, love them a lot.
Love them a lot. Good advice. And the last question is, are you reading any books now, and what are you reading?
Well, I just finished a book called the Bauhaus Group, about Bauhaus in Weimar, Germany. Also, I'm working and gnawing away at a book called the Oxford Precise Parallel New Testament, which has 8 different translations, but I have to scratch one because it's Greek. But the other 7 are a variety of English translations. And I've hauled out a really nice 1-volume complete Shakespeare, and I've kind of reread all my favorites, and I'm pushing into terra cognita of things that I should have read and haven't. But by having my own library, I've also been rereading some Thomas Mann, and I'm in about a third of the way into rereading Dr. Faustus, which is still enjoyable.
Well, excellent. That is excellent. Well, multiple people who have watched the program today want to thank you so much for your service from World War II. And I want to add my personal thank you as well. It is such a treat to be able to have a conversation with you and learn so much from your experiences. And we just thank you from the bottom of our hearts, from the Colonnade Club and all of us at UVA and all around the Virginia area. We thank you so very much for taking time and talking with us this evening. We hope you have a great evening.
Thank you.
All right. Good night. Thank you, one and all.